We've all heard of Cyberpunk, but what is Cyberpunk? A casual explanation might end up in a ramble about cyborgs, laser guns, neon lights, and rainy city nights. But behind that facade of neon and chrome lies a cultural movement. It masks the seedy underbelly of crime, corruption, corporate authoritarianism, and the dangers of rampant technological progress. Skyscrapers extend as far as the eye can see, and for every brightly lit ramen shop or tech emporium offering the latest in bleeding-edge gadgets, you're just as likely to find yourself in a dingy alley, surrounded by poverty and addiction. The overabundance of technological wonders and indulgences punctuate the decrepit slums of the megacities and sprawling metropolises of a dystopian future, which encapsulates Cyberpunk's most fundamental definition: high-tech, low-life. It's easy to see why these themes are so popular. It seems like every day we take a step closer to the future we saw on television. Robotic arms, self-driving cars, smart homes, killer drones, and an economy driven by our unquenchable thirst for the newest, sleekest machine. These themes are prevalent in all forms of art, from novels to film, from television to video games. And in this documentary series, we'll explore the decades-long history of the genre, its origins, its many influences, and how these ideas inspired neo-futurism, both in entertainment and many of the technologies we use today. So let's jack in to one of the most fascinating movements in recent history: Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is an offshoot of science fiction, though it explores a starkly different vision of the future than its forebears. The genre embraces the punk and early hacker subcultures, bringing to light the dichotomy of a high-technology world inhabited by denizens deprived of most of these luxuries, despite the advancement of society as a whole. This worldview paralleled the growing pessimism in the late 1960s and 70s. After the moral unshackling of the free love era and the emergence of modern drug culture, America was torn apart politically by the tumultuous Vietnam War, a controversial presidency ending in resignation, and a festering mistrust of authority. The conflict between the haves and have-nots also feeds into another major theme of cyberpunk, often depicting future dystopias where megacorporations wield more power than governments and rule the world from lofty skyscrapers, overlooking the streets where cyberpunk heroes try to make ends meet doing illicit jobs, either for these corporations or against them. Some may be able to afford cybernetic augmentations, swapping organic body parts with machine replacements that make them stronger, faster, or more in tune with the endless expanse of cyberspace at their fingertips. But are these cybernetically enhanced people still human? Or are they the next phase of human evolution? At what point does the line between man and machine blur? These are the questions and themes that drive cyberpunk. Unlike its more optimistic science fiction predecessors, cyberpunk showed us the dark side, revealing the dangerous side effects of the drug of futurism. The world was sweeping up the still warm ashes of World War II when mathematicians and philosophers noted the rise of cybernetic technology in modern living. New inventions became more prominent in day-to-day life, and the embrace of these new mechanical marvels inspired visions of the future and what such a life would hold for mankind. This mode of thinking inspired a new wave of writers and artists, many of whom used these advancements to predict what our lives would be like in the far future. One such author was the influential sci-fi icon, Philip K. Dick, who made a startling discovery while researching his post-World War II alternate history novel, Man in the High Castle. Philip read a German officer's journal in which the soldier complained that the screams of starving children kept him awake at night, not out of guilt, but more as a nuisance. These startling revelations inspired PKD's concept of the android, a machine that resembled a real person, but with one critical difference: the absence of empathy. Among a myriad of inspired work, his most famous was 1968's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? In it, he explored the question of what it truly means to be an authentic human being, and not an unfeeling, uncaring machine devoid of emotions and empathy. In the novel's setting, entire subcultures emerged, where citizens would prove their humanity by caring for animals, and the presence of dangerous androids would be sniffed out through rigorous empathy testing, and enforced through state-funded bounty hunters. This revolutionary novel helped sow the seeds of what would become the cyberpunk genre as we know it. Do Androids Dream also explored the concept of a shared virtual reality experience, nearly 3 decades before it hit the mainstream. Even though home electronics were still primitive, the concept of artificial intelligence was brewing in the zeitgeist of the 1970s. One of the first films to capture this growing idea with a fearful eye was Colossus, the Forbin Project. The movie follows a brilliant American computer scientist who creates an all-powerful computer program designed to solve the world's problems: hunger, politics, war, and disease. The end result is a cautionary tale of what would happen if the world was given to a benevolent AI that decided human judgment was too flawed to retain their dominion over the planet. In a terrifying turn of events where a creation outgrew its creator, Colossus learns from and fuses with another AI developed in Russia. This new supercomputer then decides to take global matters into its own hands as it conquers the world in the name of the unflinching march of progress. One of the most famous films to capture this technological anxiety was Westworld, the first theatrical movie by science fiction author Michael Crichton, perhaps best known for penning Jurassic Park, the highest-grossing film released worldwide at its time. Unlike that movie, however, Crichton wrote and directed Westworld himself. Westworld vividly imagines a near future where theme parks are filled with lifelike androids, subservient to the whims of their mortal masters. These constructs are used for target practice, role-playing props, and even pursuits of pleasure. It's a grotesque look at the moral indifference shown to those who are deemed less than human. Unsuspecting customers enjoy the park's many attractions across medieval, Roman, and Wild West settings, all without regard for the harmless androids who have safety measures put in place so that no danger can befall the humans. But when a glitch that goes unnoticed disables this safeguard, all 3 parks become slaughterhouses. The previously helpless androids become the hunters, and their abusers, the hunted. In a chilling pursuit, one of the last remaining park guests runs from an android gunslinger, played by screen legend Yul Brynner. In a sort of satirical play on his role in The Magnificent Seven, he is an unforgiving and seemingly indestructible machine with just one purpose: to kill. The scenes that showed the world through the gunslinger's electronic eyes were the very first time computer graphics were used in a movie. The unstoppable cyborg archetype on display here was obviously a big inspiration for James Cameron's science fiction thriller, The Terminator, a decade later. Westworld was followed by Future World, a strong but less iconic sequel, and a TV show spin-off in 1980, and was rebooted again in 2016 as an acclaimed TV series. Westworld was one of the earliest and most chilling visualizations of cybernetic beings that doubtlessly had an influence on future cyberpunk works as they were developed. French artist Moebius teamed up with American author Dan O'Bannon for The Long Tomorrow, a short story in the 1976 issue of Metal Hurlant, a French comic series known in the States as Heavy Metal Magazine. It was a visceral exploration of a depraved future, filled with flying cars, megacities, murder, and mystery. The technology-glazed neo-noir realized in A Long Tomorrow consumed other writers and artists, and acted as a visual foundation for many works to come. The gloomy outlook people had at the time no doubt influenced 2000 AD's dystopian worldview of America, a toxic wasteland punctuated by colossal megacities spanning the size of multiple states. This 1977 British comic series was deeply influential, and one of its leading figures, Judge Dredd, is one of the most iconic characters ever designed. The Judge himself was a brutal depiction of law enforcement, totalitarian government, and a fallible court system all rolled into one: judge, jury, and executioner. These were the early literary influences that would lay down the groundwork for cyberpunk as a self-contained genre, distinct from science fiction. A small band of beatnik authors would draw from these sources to create a new wave of futuristic narrative, one that would paint worlds of technologically augmented societies and the underdogs and antiheroes that lived there. Names like Bruce Sterling, Walter John Williams, and William Gibson were seminal in the development of early cyberpunk literature, such as the tech-themed short stories published in Omni magazine in the early 80s, like Johnny Mnemonic and Burning Chrome. These stories were some of the earliest examples of raw cyberpunk, tackling themes of the increasingly tightening grip of computerization on our day-to-day lives. Though mostly featuring stylish technobabble and evocative imagery, rather than hard science, these stories more than made up for their factual embellishments with a chilling prescience of what our future could hold. These ideas were different and bizarre, and while not entirely new, had a raw edge to them. Their purveyors were collectively referred to as cyberpunks by Gardner Dozois, a science fiction magazine editor who borrowed the term from a Bruce Bethke short story of the same name. It became a brand of nonconformity and anti-establishment thinking, and that distanced it from the science fiction status quo, and thus the term cyberpunk was sealed into pop culture. After a death in the family and a rough falling out of the troubled movie adaptation based on Frank Herbert's Dune, director Ridley Scott focused his attention on work to keep his mind off of things. With some convincing by its producer after over a decade of development hell, Scott was compelled toward Philip K. Dick's proto-cyberpunk novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and got to work on a cinematic vision of the film. It's an inherently philosophical story about humanity following World War terminus, and the remaining civilization's dogmatic adherence to empathy as a human ideal. During the film's development, Scott purchased another, unrelated adaptation's title, simply because he liked the name better. And so the most iconic cyberpunk film ever made, Blade Runner, was born. It's an edgier, more materialistic interpretation of PKD's novel, foregoing the more on-the-nose themes of piety and social obligation, and laser-focusing on the core story of a bounty hunter tracking down human-like androids, in this adaptation known as replicants. The infusion of 1940s post-war imagery and motifs was palpable in the unusually retro fashion in the film. Blade Runner took the more pious protagonist of Rick Deckard and reimagined him as a rugged, jaded detective, like in the noir classics. Another Philip Marlowe or Sam Spade, trenchcoat, grim attitude and all. The movie's setting is the character in the film that speaks the loudest, with a stirring soundtrack by legendary Greek composer Vangelis, and one of the most memorable openings in cinematic history. Foreboding spires of metal and neon pierce the blackened skyline of future Los Angeles. The whole city looks like something from a dream, or perhaps a nightmare, that hasn't quite made its mind up yet. So much of the backstory and world building is communicated visually. It's like the mile-high skyscrapers and urban infrastructure is in slow-motion destruction, with pillars of fire spouting from the tops, as if the entire city is one big, churning factory in itself. Flying cars, searing neon lights, and giant electronic billboards haunt the seemingly bottomless depths of the city. Always night, always damp or rainy. It was a city that never slept, yet never saw the light of day. Everything in Blade Runner takes on sort of a timeless feeling, with decades-old fashion, anachronistic architecture, and vehicles with advanced propulsion technology, but stylized after automobiles of the 40s and 50s. It all felt so real. Painstaking detail went into the film's visual effects, which included handcrafting an entire miniature city. After a visual feast of an opening, the stage is set. In a future Earth with off-world colonies in need of an advanced and expendable workforce, cybernetic humanoids called replicants are created. At first, they are a perfect solution, but eventually a design flaw manifests, and the replicants develop emotions and become dangerously unstable. A 4-year lifespan is put into place as a safety measure to circumvent renegade replicants. But in the latest outbreak, a crew of advanced Nexus 6 models are reported to have escaped the off-world colonies and come back to Earth. and the only solution for this problem is to send Blade Runners, specialized hunters, to retire these dangerous replicants. The iconic Voight-Kampff testing machine is the only reliable way to differentiate a replicant from a human. It's an interesting parallel to the real-life test that computer scientist Alan Turing proposed back in the 1950s, designed to estimate an artificial intelligence's capability of human-like cognizance. The film's Voight-Kampff test is sort of an anti-Turing test, where a suspected replicant is asked highly calculated non-sequiturs in order to eventually trigger an emotional response. Our very first dialogue is between a Blade Runner screening a new worker. The testee, Leon, seems nervous and awkward. The questions are abstract hypotheticals with some sort of empathetic tone. Why wouldn't you help a struggling tortoise? What are some good things that come into your mind about your mother? And the like. Presumably, a human would brush it off or reject the premise. But for a replicant, they have to compute the solution, for which there is no logic. It's like putting a nonsense formula into a calculator, then sitting on the equals key, spinning and spinning until Leon suddenly snaps into a murderous rage and sets the stage for everything to come. Blade Runner takes the themes that manifested in the early Cyberpunk short stories and boldly runs with them. The film, like the novel it was based on, asks the question, do the androids that walk among us have hopes and fears, dreams and desires? What differentiates man and machine? Or even further, can a machine become human? Or are they merely programmed, soulless, constructed labor, whose presumed sentience is a glitch that needs to be corrected in the code, and nothing more? This question is echoed in the tragic character of Rachel, a replicant imprinted with false memories, with the goal of making her more human-like. But when she discovers that she isn't real, she undergoes a slow and heartbreaking acceptance. All the while, Deckard begins to question his own humanity, while trying to help Rachel find hers. In another subplot, the replicant ringleader, Roy Batty, is a renegade on a quest to meet his maker, literally. Upon climbing the chain of command from an optics engineer to a genetic designer, all the way up to Eldon Tyrell, the founder of the replicant-creating Mega Corporation. When Batty meets both his father and his creator in the same person, he is filled with both love and hatred, for the one thing he desires, elongated life, is the one thing that Tyrell cannot grant him.
You were made as well as we could make you,
but not to last.
The light that burns twice as bright burns half as long, and you have burned so very, very brightly, Roy.
Both Batty and Deckard are outsiders, rubbing shoulders with the powers that be, but their destinies are not scribed by themselves. At the beginning of the film, Deckard is trying to get out of the killing business, but is drawn back into taking down replicants, despite his best efforts. In that time, he wonders if he has become as cold and unempathetic as the very machines he hunts.
May I ask you a personal question?
Sure.
Have you ever retired a human by mistake?
No.
But in your position, that is a risk.
On the other hand, Batty seeks a future for himself and his friends, but is bound by an irreversible 4-year lifespan. He feels robbed of the greatest gift that one could have, and he struggles for a way to grasp it. In this way, neither character can escape their fate, and ultimately, that's what leads to their mutual respect at the end. They are both cogs in a great machine, of which they have no power to change. Blade Runner shows off some intriguing technology. The most famous example is the photo enhancement scene, which shows Deckard panning, zooming, and moving the camera position of a photograph after it was taken. Video phone calls, and the chilling realism of a future where all animals in the world are now barcoded counterfeit products due to the apocalyptic events preceding the story. Many of the cityscapes, buildings, and machinery in Blade Runner were imagined by the highly respected concept artist, futurist, and designer Sid Mead. His work spans decades and has either sculpted or highly influenced countless icons of futurist media. Mead once called science fiction reality ahead of schedule, an attitude that is abundantly present in numerous films, video games, and media that bears his mark. From Blade Runner to Aliens, from Star Trek to Elysium, his concept art feels lived in, visionary, but most of all, real. Though this future noir exploration of humanity wasn't exactly what 1982's audiences were expecting, this box office bomb became an absolute cult classic as time went on, in no small part due to Ridley Scott's invention of the director's cut, specifically to address the undesirable edits to the film due to studio intervention. Blade Runner remains one of the most celebrated cinematic masterpieces of all time. and has been imitated by countless cyberpunk media to this day. 2 short weeks after Blade Runner hit the silver screen, another film released, which also featured Sid Mead's creative influence. Tron wowed the world with some of the earliest computer graphics imagery ever developed for a Hollywood film, starring Jeff Bridges as a computer programmer who, in a freak accident, gets sucked into his company's mainframe. He is spawned into a virtual world as a user, and computer processes and programs are represented as towers, tanks, and other humans. As a family-friendly Disney film, Tron was an unlikely influence on the cyberpunk genre, if for no other reason than its vivid portrayal of cyberspace. Brightly colored grids set in an expansive void. These visuals set the stage for what the circuits, software, and computer processes might look like from within, with a heavy dose of creative license, of course. Tron would set the standard for the cyberspace aesthetic for generations to come. William Gibson, an aspiring writer working on his debut novel Neuromancer, cited Tron as one of his inspirations for the visualization of cyberspace in his own work, saying that the movie was the bleeding-edge digital aesthetic. Sadly, many early cyberpunk and cyberspace films were box office flops. Blade Runner and Tron both released within 2 weeks of each other, and, in a strange twist of fate, both brought in a paltry $33 million each, with expensive visual effects budgets.
The sky above the port was the color of television, tuned to a dead channel.
In the summer of 1982, William Gibson had finished about a third of Neuromancer when Blade Runner hit the cinemas. By the time he saw the first 20 minutes of the film, Gibson was sure that his fledgling novel was doomed, and that everyone would assume that he copied the film's style. Panicking, Gibson rewrote the first 2/3 of the book 12 times, out of a fear that he would be permanently shamed. And yet, when Neuromancer was published in 1984, it quickly became an underground hit, spreading through pop culture like circuits on a motherboard. Neuromancer follows the former hacker, Case, in a downward spiral after his body is permanently damaged, and he's no longer able to do the one thing he was good at, jacking in to the Matrix, the cyberspace that connects all the world's computers, citizens, hackers, and corporations. It's this stark vision of the future that permanently outlined the tenets of cyberpunk. Set in the Sprawl, a grungy metropolitan zone that blankets half the eastern coast, filled with lowlives, organized crime, hedonism, and the cybernetically augmented. Case's luck turns for the better when he meets the hauntingly beautiful Molly, a razor girl, fitted with retractable claws and augmented eyes covered by lifeless, mirrored lenses. She saves him from a self-destructive path and imminent danger, then presents an offer to Case on behalf of the powerful and mysterious benefactor, Armitage. They fix Case up, make him able to hack again, and give him a new lease on life, with the caveat that he takes on a very dangerous mission. He reluctantly agrees, half deciding to ditch the operation and run for his life, but he soon discovers their contingency plan, a slowly degrading poison sac inserted into his body during the surgery, that if he leaves untreated, will cripple his hacking ability and bring him back to square one, a broken man just like before, in indentured servitude, hiring for a big-time cyber heist, and preparing for the mission of their lives. All the while, Case is being contacted and manipulated by an artificial intelligence with its own agenda. Gibson's grisly vision of the future would establish many tropes and themes often replicated by cyberpunk media. Things such as decking, street samurai, cyberspace, and intrusion countermeasures electronics, also known as ICE, all owe their origins to Gibson's Sprawl trilogy, composed of the books Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive. Neuromancer became the first science fiction Triple Crown winner, scoring both Nebula and Hugo Awards as the year's best novel, and incidentally earned the Philip K. Dick Award as the best paperback original. It would eventually go on to sell more than 6.5 million copies worldwide. Part neo-noir, part heist story, Neuromancer crystallized how a cyberpunk setting looks, feels, and reads for decades to come, with ultra-slick lingo, breathtaking imagery, and a classy stream of consciousness. It was a peek into our dark and high-tech future through a hyper-stylized lens.
People do forget that there was no state-of-the-art in personal computing when I read Neuromancer, and that's why I was using a typewriter. Neuromancer and the first Macintosh were released in in the same year, and someone told me recently in the same month. That's difficult for young people to imagine, I know.
The mid-1980s saw a virtual explosion of cyberpunk media across all spectrums of entertainment, from film to television, from Japanese animation to tabletop games. Case in point, Cyberpunk, the tabletop role-playing game by Mike Pondsmith, which was directly inspired by Hardwired, the futuristic corporate warfare novel by Walter John Williams. Cyberpunk and its second edition, Cyberpunk 2020, frolicked with the rule of cool, and even had style over substance as one of the core guidelines in creating a character. The game puts players in the bloodied shoes of hackers, mercenaries, and company men, all struggling for money and power in the seedy playground of Night City. And though the game didn't pick up as big of an audience as bestsellers like Dungeons & Dragons, it settled comfortably as an underdog RPG, and further expanded on the collective cyberpunk lore. The popular card game, Netrunner, would later spawn out of Cyberpunk 2020's fertile setting as well. A year later, another pen and paper game hit the shelves. Shadowrun blended urban fantasy with the rise of elves, dwarves, and other fantasy denizens into a futuristic, dystopian world where megacorporations reign supreme. At its core, Shadowrun took familiar fantasy role-playing, like Dungeons & Dragons, and merged it with William Gibson's Neuromancer, cyberpunk with a dash of Tolkien. Megacorporations, exploitation, and inequality are all themes that drive Shadowrun's world. But in this alternate history, magic and metahuman races emerge mysteriously into our modern society, creating new kinds of prejudice, conflict, and dangers overnight. Shadowrun's hybrid of fantasy and dark futurism made so many wild scenarios possible. The dragon's the CEO of a German megacorporation. You can walk the streets and see cyborg samurai, mages, trolls, elves, and orcs alike. Shamans can summon spirits to battle their enemies, while deckers hack their way through the Matrix, and riggers remotely control drones and slice electronic security systems. Such a rich, vibrant world of neon-soaked slums, old-school superstitions, and new-school transhumanism, all backed up by a colorful vocabulary. By calling each other chummers, people drink the ever-popular Soykaf, and of course, have dealings with the notorious mercenaries known as Shadowrunners. There's just something addictive about the wholesale augmentation of limbs, bones, and nerves with flashy cyberware. You could spec out your character with massive claws, conceal shotguns embedded in your forearms, or implant data jacks to communicate with electronics directly through your mind. The meshing of flesh, circuit, and steel, all in one. As you might surmise, Shadowrun owes a massive debt to not only Blade Runner, but especially to Gibson's work on the Sprawl series. Many of its most popular ideas were lifted whole cloth. The virtual cyberspace known as the Matrix, Street Samurai, Razor Girls, the New Yen currency, and plenty of other references all exist in Shadowrun. Gibson has spoken about FASA Corporation's zealous borrowing from a source material, but other than a dismissing eye and a complete denouncement of Shadowrun, he hasn't gone further than that, once saying, "I've never earned a nickel, but I wouldn't sue them. It's a fair cop. I'm sure there are people who could sue me if they were so inclined." Shadowrun may have steered cyberpunk toward urban fantasy rather than the attempted hard science fiction of its predecessors, but it was one of the most popular tabletop RPGs of all time, and acted as a major gateway drug to cyberpunk in the 80s and 90s. As time went on, the genre was gaining momentum. Other films began to adapt many cyberpunk themes while maintaining proven plot structures. Popcorn films with a cyberpunk twist. As computers began to proliferate into the consumer industry, Hollywood eventually caught on and got to work with new down-to-earth sci-fi concepts. One of the earliest and most popular movies to tackle computer and hacker culture was the summer blockbuster Boy Hacks World movie, War Games, where a young Matthew Broderick accidentally hacks into a military artificial intelligence and starts playing what he thinks is just a strategy game, but in reality is threatening the world with real thermonuclear war. Another sleeper hit was Trancers, where a detective from the 23rd century goes back to the 1980s to stop a hypnotic death cult bent on ruining the world. It nails all the hallmarks: high-tech gadgets, Skid Row, noir references, and even a punk rocker sidekick. A cult classic that launched several sequels, Trancers is a fun flick, but not a particularly deep analysis of the human condition. More action movies started to take notice of these themes. Heavily inspired by the works of Harlan Ellison, The Terminator hit movie theaters with a shotgun blast. While not a cyberpunk film per se, there's a lot of strong thematic imagery woven into the movie. It depicts an apocalyptic future where the dregs of mankind struggle to overthrow the cyborg stranglehold of the world. In response to the growing strength of the resistance, a Terminator, a robotic soldier disguised in human flesh, is sent back in time with one mission: to eliminate the mother of the future savior of mankind. Arnold Schwarzenegger's most iconic role as an unstoppable cybernetic killing machine would be seared into our memory for decades. With the help of fantastic special effects and a tight-knit sci-fi slasher flick premise, the movie has been solidified in pop culture as having the most famous of cyborg designs, an intimidating steel skeleton with glowing red eyes. And in turn, it has inspired many future depictions of cybernetic body augmentation. Video games were far behind what movies could do narratively in the 1980s, but the attempt at adapting Blade Runner to an interactive format was met with dismal reaction, likely due to technical limitations. Another complication was that the publisher wasn't able to get the rights to the book or the movie, instead having to jump through an odd legal loophole and license the movie's soundtrack. In what is the most literal interpretation of a story possible, it essentially boils down to a basic runner game where you have to hunt down so-called Reploidroids, dodging cars and crowds before gunning them down. Between runs, you navigate the city in a maze-like world where you locate potential suspects as blips on your map, which you can land your spinner down to with the intent to pursue. Simple and repetitive. Even so, the Blade Runner game had some potential, especially had it been on more powerful hardware and offered more variety in terms of action gameplay or storyline. But despite the recognizable brand name, it made only a minor blip in the industry at the time, a forgotten game releasing at the tail end of the video game crash. As Cyberpunk further steeped into pop culture, so did we experience the short-lived but beloved mascot of cyberspace. American actor Matt Frewer starred in the BBC-made TV movie Max Headroom, 20 minutes into the future, where he played a cocky star journalist named Edison Carter. The relentless Carter nearly exposes a conspiracy involving blipverts, TV ads that can kill. The powerful media executives behind the plot manage to trigger a traffic barrier to kill Carter as he tries to escape the building. Panicking after the attempted murder of a celebrity reporter, the media corporation's computer genius proposes a plan: preserve the mind of the severely wounded Carter and convert him into a computer-generated character. Thus, they hope to cover up his supposed murder. Through a bunch of greedy mishaps, the AI lands in the hands of a couple of scavengers, who decide to broadcast it on a whim. The AI quickly develops a wisecracking personality and names itself Max Headroom, after the warning label on the object that nearly killed its human host. Ironically, its original and unpredictable show soars in the ratings and proves to be a formidable competitor to the media execs who tried to have Carter killed. Watching this movie over 3 decades later, there's a chilling prescience to it. Max regularly checks his viewer count in real time and reacts to his audience like he was a live streamer on Twitch or YouTube. Max quickly became a cultural icon of the 1980s and has appeared in numerous commercials, cameos, and even an infamous television broadcast hijacking. Rapper Eminem would later parody Max Headroom in his music video for Rap God, now sitting at over 1 billion views.
Max! What I want to know is, why are the only funny lines on this show the ones behind me?
Films like RoboCop, set in the desolate hellscape of Detroit, embrace many themes of cyberpunk, such as transhumanism and class struggle. Despite the title sounding like a bog-standard action movie, RoboCop was set in a satirical near-future setting where society's moral fiber has broken down. Soaked in a comical cynicism brought to life by director Paul Verhoeven, the story follows Alex Murphy, a straight-laced cop whose life is destroyed by a sadistic crime lord, only to be involuntarily revived as a cyborg as a last-ditch experiment. Now a husk of a man, living in a cybernetic armored shell, the movie is actually a tragic tale of Murphy's loss of humanity as he devolves further into an unthinking, justice-dealing machine, haunted by fragments of memories from his former life and family, His torment is crystallized in one horrible moment.
I can feel them, but I can't remember them.
RoboCop, like many future Verhoeven movies, features a deeper movie underneath the shallow Hollywood veneer. The crime lord who kills Murphy is an unconventional, spectacled villain named Clarence Boddicker, a smart guy rather than your typical thug boss. Boddicker is secretly working with one of the executives at the megacorporation OCP, the designer of police tech such as the menacing ED-209 robot and RoboCop himself. This parallels the arms dealers who profit from both sides of a war. RoboCop cleverly criticized the unchecked and growing crime presence in urban America, as well as the increasingly militarized police force, all while showing that heroes do still exist. OCP's indifference after watching one of their directors get shot into a million pieces at an ED-209 product demonstration bordered on the ridiculous. It was like selling a driverless tank as a replacement for a beat cop. RoboCop was met with huge success and launched a comic series, multiple sequels, a TV show, eventually a reboot movie, and even a crowdfunded statue in its adopted setting of Detroit. The film remains today an icon of cinema and a true-to-form cyberpunk story, as told from the so-called authority rather than from the underdog's perspective.
Thank you for your cooperation.
The movie's success also launched various iterations of video games for the arcade and consoles. It didn't try to do anything deep or thought-provoking, instead serving as a visceral, beat-em-up, shoot-em-up hybrid, like Double Dragon meets Contra, with a robotic, kick-ass hero. The game enjoyed modest success, and would be followed by sequels as the movie franchise continued. The Running Man follows a similar suit. This 1987 Stephen King adaptation features another dystopian future, with megacorporations reigning supreme. After a grisly prison breakout, the escapees find themselves in a desperate fight for survival, with only one last chance at freedom, to win the death gauntlet known as the Running Man. It's brilliant satire of the gluttonous game show media, pro wrestling and boxing promoters, as well as the public's growing desensitization toward violence. Not to mention predating the reality show craze that would seize the attention of audiences for decades. The movie directly inspired the hit competition TV series American Gladiators, which a producer purportedly got the show greenlit using clips from Running Man, explaining, "We're doing exactly this, except for the murdering part." On the other side of the world, Japan took to the Blade Runner aesthetic, and the 80s and 90s were chock full of classic anime with strong cyberpunk themes. Bubblegum Crisis was a stark depiction of wealth inequality, with mega corporations treating the world like it's their own personal chessboard, and powerful cyborgs being used for both good and evil deeds. Despite its questionable name and deceivingly bright aesthetic, the show and its spin-offs explored the bureaucratic shielding of corruption and the potential dangers of unchecked capitalism. The 1988 anime film Akira embraced cyberpunk to a T. It follows a biker vigilante and his friend who are caught up in a clandestine plot, when an accident lands one of them with horrific psychic powers. There are a ton of cyberpunk tropes here: uber-stylized motorcycles, laboratory experiments gone wrong, and the rise of Neo-Tokyo from the ashes of a cataclysmic event, paralleling the cities lost during World War Terminus in Blade Runner. Akira is set against a city rebuilt, one that is being torn apart by terrorism, anti-authority protests, and corruption. Through high-octane action and an ever-deepening plot, Akira managed to wow audiences around the world with gorgeous animation and brutal body horror. Its unforgettable imagery would kickstart many other cyberpunk anime series, and is considered one of the greatest animated sci-fi works of all time. With the rise in technology, video games would become sophisticated enough to properly wrestle with the themes of cyberpunk. Most notably, Snatcher, a gritty, futuristic detective game, designed by Hideo Kojima, now famous for his smash hit series Metal Gear, first releasing a year earlier. Snatcher is set in a tumultuous future where there's an imminent menace of cyborgs who snatch the body and roles of humans and hide among the populace. They may perfectly resemble people on the outside, but are robotic, with superior strength and high-tech weaponry underneath. You play a gumshoe bounty hunter who must piece together evidence at grisly murder scenes to track down suspected snatchers. It's been said, good artists copy, great artists steal. If that's true, then by that logic, Kojima is the greatest artist in the world. Snatcher's protagonist was traced from Blade Runner's Rick Deckard, and even the department calls the cyborg bounty hunters runners. One bounty hunter, Random Hegel, is a carbon copy of pop musician Sting's character in the 1984 adaptation of Dune, and entire shots were traced from Blade Runner and its concept art. Despite treading dangerously close to plagiarism at times, Snatcher was one of the first and most engaging simulators of cyberpunk noir we've experienced to date. A surprisingly modern take on the adventure game formula, the game was presented from a cinematic and graphical point of view, often taking a first-person perspective view of the city, its inhabitants, and the sometimes macabre visuals in front of you. The cyberpunk setting and presentation carry the gameplay, which is familiar to pre-point-and-click adventures, with various commands like talk, look, and basic item usage, as do many games in the genre. But learning the specifics, guessing at the many story twists, and enjoying the quaint details Konami put into the game is still captivating, decades on. Snatcher hits all the right beats, high-tech cyborgs, lowlives, and punks abound, and a neo-noir aesthetic, though it does so in a heightened way, and is tonally inconsistent, sometimes coming off as incredibly cartoony, despite other scenes of legitimate horror and thematic depth. It remains one of the shining early examples of cyberpunk interactive media, and has been remade with better visuals multiple times for various platforms, namely the Sega CD and Dreamcast.
One of the things that the so-called cyberpunk writers have done, either consciously or unconsciously, is to look around the world outside, look at the fine arts as well, and import whatever they could use into to the sort of literary ghetto of science fiction.
In the late 80s, William Gibson's Neuromancer was advocated for other media adaptations, primarily by renegade psychologist Timothy Leary, a friend of Gibson who had purchased the rights to a video game and even helped shop a movie pitch to Hollywood for years. The book also got a gorgeous, yet sadly incomplete, graphic novel adaptation, and Interplay picked up the video game interpretation. Brian Fargo led the development, known for making Wasteland, which heavily inspired the Fallout series years later. Neuromancer the game was an early point-and-click adventure in the style of Maniac Mansion and Monkey Island. The game has a charming look to it, but it doesn't quite capture the desolate and cynical cyberpunk feel the novel purported. However, underneath the primitive presentation is a fascinating exploration into the sprawl. The writing is a combination of situations and dialogue explicitly written by Interplay, but also contains quotes plucked directly from the novel. The most interesting situations are probably the optional scenarios you can get stuck in, like in the very first scene. You're at a diner after a pricey meal. You can either withdraw money from the bank and pay the bill, or you can dine and dash, and get arrested and tried for your crimes. It's these peaks behind the linear storyline that make the game most engaging. Neuromancer comes into its own during its brief cyberspace sequences, where Case navigates the Matrix, represented by surreal geometric forms. Though short-lived and obtuse, it inspired the imagination, and this cyberspace frontier would be even further explored by future video games, such as the Shadowr series. More and more, the 1980s were filled with cyberpunk spreading out across a number of different mediums. And more importantly, it was beginning to become a distinct genre, independent of its science fiction origins. The genre as a whole came to a head in June 1989. Essays written by various literary critics, scientists, and scholars were presented at a conference hosted by the Universities of Leeds and California Riverside. It was at the symposium that academics, media experts, and fiction writers debated the central points of cyberpunk and the future of fiction. The question of where cyberpunk came from, what it is, and where it was going were points that were hotly contested.
I really don't think of myself as a predictive, extrapolative science fiction writer. I think of myself as I don't know, almost as a surrealist. I think that what I'm doing is taking a sort of hallucinatory, very impressionistic take on contemporary reality and presenting it as science fiction. Science fiction is my excuse for what I do rather than what I do. It's a flag of convenience.
The term cyberpunk itself seemed to provoke an emotional response from many of the participants. For example, although none would deny the importance of writers such as Gibson, Sterling, and Williams, many hard science fiction writers criticized the genre for relying too heavily on style over substance, claiming their works didn't use enough researched extrapolation, that is to say, educated guesses about the future, rather than stylized fantasy. In response, the genre's proponents assigned their creation an identity that separated it both from science fiction and mainstream fiction. It had its own literary canon, as well as criteria for determining what was and wasn't considered part of the genre. That meant that cyberpunk was free to exhibit whatever literary styles it wanted to, because it was much more than simply being a facet of science fiction. It was its own thing, and while it shared much of the same foundation as the House of Asimov, Herbert, Dick, and Clarke, it was not beholden to the same principles as the genres that preceded it were. The 80s may have given cyberpunk its birth, but it would be the 1990s that would further augment it and shape it into something both recognizable and even fashionable. There was a veritable boom of movies, TV shows, and video games on the horizon, and not only obscure media or cult classics, some of the most successful blockbusters ever made. The end of the decade wasn't the end of the genre. It was only the beginning. Thanks for watching this introduction to Cyberpunk. It's been a long time coming, and we're incredibly happy with the final product. A shout out to Shola Shaska for his help in writing and researching this project. And my deepest appreciation goes out to my patrons for helping make this level of production possible. Stay tuned for parts 2, 3, and 4 of this series. And thank you for watching.